We can start today continuing lectures that we've had as far as the Centers of Excellence and the mentorship program is concerned. We have another very important topic, and I will briefly introduce it as we go along. That's on anti-IL-6 therapy, another treatment strategy which, in my mind, has been more misused than used properly, and therefore we need to really understand its position in terms of COVID-19 and the harm that it can do. Before I start the introduction and introduce the panel, I would request Shri Love Agarwal from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to give his introductory remarks.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Saab. Again, let me welcome all our colleagues who have joined for this webinar. This is 7th in the series of 10 webinars we had planned through our National Center of Excellence in Delhi, along with our Regional Center of Excellences as well as the State Center of Excellences. We had been covering from what needs to be done in case of mild cases, how they have to be tackled, the role of oxygen therapy. We talked about remdesivir so far. Now today when we are discussing about IL-6 therapy, one very pertinent point we would like to request all the colleagues who are present here is that with the wider expansion of infection in 2-tier and 3-tier towns, it is very critical that whole clinical management protocol should become demystified. It is very critical to ensure that every healthcare staff knows about the protocol. I am only submitting and highlighting at the risk of repeating this point in every point when we are interacting with each other is because primarily we feel that this is the need of our earlier. We realized that the cases were primarily coming from urban areas and our focus was primarily only on the COVID dedicated facility. But now with wider spread of infection, while containment continues to remain our focus, we need to ensure that this protocol is taught to everyone and there is a common clarity in terms of managing this disease. I would like to thank AIIMS Delhi, Director AIIMS in particular, for taking this initiative, and I would request if we can kindly continue with the technical session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shri Love Agarwalji, and I'd really like to place on record the work and the coordination actually done by the ministry. This would not have been possible without the extensive and untiring effect of the effort done by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. For us, it would not have been possible to coordinate it in the manner it has been done. But I think we're working together to really save lives and really try and take this pandemic head on and try and do our best considering the way the cases are going and how the pandemic is spreading. Today, we are talking on something which I personally feel is again very, very important, and that is anti-IL-6 therapy. The reason for this is that there has been, like I said in the beginning, a lot of misuse as far as tocilizumab is concerned. And it is a drug which probably caused a lot of panic in terms of demand during the first wave, where I remember I had gone to Gujarat and there were people saying that they've been standing in line for 2 days to get one vial of tocilizumab, and it was thought to be that this is going to be life-saving. We know that this is the stage of COVID-19 which is probably the most difficult to treat. When a patient goes into severe COVID, from moderate to severe disease, when his saturations really crashes, if you have a CT scan, it shows a very high CT score, and his markers are across the roof. I mean, you will have such high levels of CRP, D-dimer, IL-6, that you're really wondering what's happening. Then there is this knee-jerk reaction, should I use tocilizumab? But the data currently, if you look at it, is not very strong. And the more recent study, the COVACTOR trial published in the NEJM in February, which was released by the company, I think it was in October itself, was a negative study. There are a number of observational studies which have shown that it may be useful, it may decrease mortality. Randomized controlled trial done properly have not been able to show that. But because of the desperate situation that patients land up in when they have severe COVID and you're seeing IL-6 levels which are very, very high, sometimes there's this knee-jerk reaction, let me give tocilizumab. The other important thing to remember is that this binds to the receptors. It's a monoclonal antibody which binds to receptors. So don't expect your IL-6 levels to come down after giving tocilizumab. They will actually go up as a part of the treatment. So that is something also important to keep in mind. Is this drug useful? in a very limited number of patients, it may have a role. I mean, from our own experience, I could say that there are times when Tosi has helped and reversed the downward trend patients have had. But I can't say that this is something that I would recommend across the board. And therefore, the most important thing that we really need to teach people is that this drug has limited role, and in that small group of patients only you should try it. If you try it across the board, you will cause more harm than good. And now we're seeing that reports coming from even Gujarat and other areas where it was used a lot of opportunistic infection, mucormycosis, fungal infection occurring more common. And this is because many of these patients who have underlying diabetes or the sugars become very high because of steroids that they've got, land up with getting tocilizumab. Itolizumab is also given, which also causes a further aggressive decline in your immune system. All of this leads to a very high chance of opportunistic infection, and rhinocerebral mucormycosis being reported more and more from various centers. Today morning, when we were having a discussion during our COVID meeting, we have currently 10 patients admitted under ENT whom they suspect have mucormycosis, and are working on treatment, surgical debridement, and antifungal. And the other point that they raised was that liposomal amphotericin and posaconazole is not freely available. There's a shortage of antifungal drugs because of the fact that the demand again has gone up. So again, keeping everything in mind, I think it's very important for us to understand the position or the place of anti-IL-6 therapy and the harm that it can do at times rather than the good. And I think that is something very important. And we have an excellent speaker, a faculty from our institute, Dr. Richa Agarwal, who will be talking on this topic on anti-IL-6 therapy. On the panel, we have Dr. Anjan Turikha, who needs no introduction. He's been here for many of our discussions, professor of anesthesia, critical care, and pain management, Dr. Neeraj Nishal from Department of Medicine, and Dr. Manish Suneja. So we will have the panel discussion after the presentation. So I'll ask Dr. Richa Agarwal to start her presentation on anti-IL-6 therapy. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak on anti-IL-6 therapy in COVID-19. I'll be presenting my discussion under the following headings: rationale of anti-IL-6 therapy in COVID-19, what are the anti-IL-6 drugs available, the evidence for their use, what the guidelines says, the indications and contraindications, and what are the newer agents available to us. It has been postulated that the COVID-19 disease has three phases. First is the phase of initial phase, which is of viral replication, and the patient presents with mild symptoms. Second is the phase in which there is a stimulation of adaptive immunity, leading to predominance of respiratory systems. And some patients, they progress to the third phase, which is the hyperinflammatory phase, leading to multi-organ involvement. Now, what exactly happens in the pulmonary and the inflammatory phase? As the COVID virus enters the alveoli, it attaches to the epithelium through specific receptors, and it incites the macrophages and the dendritic cells to form various cytokines like interleukin-1 and interleukin-6. Out of these cytokines, the most important is the interleukin-6 cytokine. It is produced by both alveolar macrophages and dendritic cells. This further incites incites the formation of acute phase reactants like ferritin, D-dimer, and CRP. IL-6 also incites other cells like WBCs to form other cytokines, thus perpetuating an inflammatory cycle and a vicious cycle leading to a cytokine storm. When these IL-6 levels, they are above a certain value, they leak into the circulation and cause multi-organ damage. These interleukin-6 levels, they cause tissue injury by causing apoptosis of the respiratory epithelial cells, which leads to capillary leak syndrome and ARDS. Higher the IL-6 levels, severe is the disease. This all pathogenesis has given us the opportunity to look into the approaches we can have in inhibition of interleukin-6. So what are the approaches we can look at for interleukin-6 inhibition in COVID-19? The three most important approaches, or the three most important categories of drugs which are available to us are: either we can have direct inhibition of the interleukin-6 molecules. These are the molecule antibodies which are against the interleukin-6. Then we can have the antibodies against the interleukin-6 receptors. In this category, our drug falls tocilizumab and sarilumab. And the third category is where we can stop the function of interleukin-6, that we can stop the signaling of interleukin-6 to produce various acute phase reactants. Here we have inhibitors of Janus activated kinase inhibitors. Coming again to the anti-interleukin-6 therapy, we have two classes which are FDA approved. These are first the anti-interleukin-6 receptor monoclonal antibodies, the tocilizumab and sarilumab, and the other is anti-IL-6 monoclonal antibodies, siltuximab. Of all these drugs, the mostly studied drug is tocilizumab, and most of the literature is available on this drug. Tocilizumab is a recombinant humanized monoclonal antibody that inhibits binding of IL-6 to membrane and soluble IL-6 receptors. It is not a new drug. It's already in use for the treatment of rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile idiopathic arthritis, giant cell arteritis, and cytokine release syndrome, which occurs during the therapy with chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy. Now, we already had experience with tocilizumab for the treatment of cytokine release syndrome, and this experience paved the way for its off-label use in severe COVID-19 since the first weeks of the pandemic. So this drug is being used since the initial weeks of the pandemic. The initial observational studies done in China and then further observational study, a large trial, it showed that it improves the survival and improves the clinical outcome. However, after that, the RCTs, there were already 7 RCTs done, which did not show any improvement benefit. These RCTs varied in the inclusion criteria, that the patients of varying severity, they were included, and also the patients who were receiving steroids. They all produced conflicting results. There was no significant improvement in clinical status or decrease in the mortality with tocilizumab. The trials, they differed in size, study design, and illness severity of the patients. They were underpowered for mortality difference, and they excluded critically ill patients. And there was also imbalances in the use of steroids, as these trials were done when steroids were not the standard of care. So there was no improvement in mortality benefit with these trials. However, recently published, there have been 2 trials which has shown mortality benefit with the use of tocilizumab. The first trial is the REMAP-CAP study, where they have studied the interleukin-6 receptor antagonist, both tocilizumab and sarilumab, in critically ill patients. So it was done across 113 sites. In this trial, what they included only the patients who were admitted to ICU. They were either on the respiratory support or cardiovascular support. 95 patients, they were randomized to tocilizumab, sarilumab, or the control group. The time to enrollment was within 2 days of hospital admission and within 24 hours of ICU admission. In the results, they could find that there was improvement in the organ support free days. That is, this organ support free days were relatively more in the tocilizumab and the sarilumab group as compared to the control. And also there was increase in the probability of survival. The authors concluded that in critically ill patients with COVID-19 who are on organ support in ICU, treatment with interleukin-6 receptors antagonist may improve outcome, including survival. Another big study, that is the recovery study that has been published just 5 to 6 days back. In this study, they included around 400,000 patients. The inclusion criteria were more relaxed in this study. In this study, they included all the patients who were having hypoxia or requiring oxygen therapy. And they have evidence of systemic inflammation, that is the CRP was more than 75. They were randomized into the 2 groups. The number of days since the onset of symptoms were 9 days, and 82% of the patients, they were receiving systemic corticosteroids at randomization. In the results, again, they have significant improvement in the mortality in the tocilizumab group, and also the number of the patients who were discharged alive were significantly more in the toci group as compared to the control group. Again, they concluded that in patients who COVID-19 patients who have hypoxia and systemic inflammation, tocilizumab improves survival and other clinical outcomes. So both the studies, they showed a good mortality benefit with the use of tocilizumab. But remember, the first study was done in critically ill patients. In the second study, they included all the patients who were hypoxic with systemic inflammation, that is the markers more than CRP more than 75 milligram per liter. However, there were some limitations. They did not collect the detailed information on non-COVID infections. This is the most feared complication with tocilizumab. They did all the good things, but they are not talking about what were the non-COVID infections the patients were having. Also, the hospital stay for many patients was more than 28 days, and therefore they could not comment on the long-term outcomes. And also it is unclear in the patients who have a CRP level of less than 75 milligrams per liter, if they would benefit from tocilizumab. Now, compiling the evidence, present evidence, what we come to know. Yes, tocilizumab is safe in hospital settings. It is only in hospital settings. Monotherapy with tocilizumab does not work. It is not going to, and here we have in COVID-19 patients all kinds of cytokine hikes, and tocilizumab appears to improve outcomes for critically ill patients on steroids. Now, if we have seen these studies, now which patients should be given tocilizumab? This is the question which we really want to answer. The National Task Force and the ICMR guidelines, which were updated on 22nd April, they say that tocilizumab may be considered. It is only may be considered in all the patients when all of the below criteria are met. It may be considered, and when all of the criteria are met, that is, there is a presence of severe disease, preferably within 24 to 48 hours of onset of severe disease or ICU admission, significantly raised biomarkers, CRP and or IL-6, not improving despite the use of steroids. So steroids are the first main line of drug, and if the patient is not improving, then we can think of, and if the patient does not have active bacterial, fungal or tubercular infection. This is quite important because of most of the patients we are having in our ICU, they have certain types of comorbidities and they have these kinds of infection also. Recommended doses 4 to 6 milligram per kg in normal saline over 1 hour. But there are certain contraindications and adverse effects which you need to keep in mind. First of all, you have to rule out that the contraindications like hypersensitivity, evidence of any active tuberculosis, or clear evidence of any other infection, and also neutropenia. When we give TCZ, it is very important that we should know what are the adverse effects. It causes infusion-related allergic reactions, deranged LFTs, and may also cause late onset secondary infections. So this is the most important thing which we are worried of, and we keep a track of it when we are giving tocilizumab. Cases of severe and disseminated strongyloidosis have also been reported in patients who were receiving both the drugs with COVID-19. Our experience, we had used tocilizumab. This was mainly in the first wave of pandemic during the first 6 months from May to October 2020. Number of patients who received tocilizumab were 39. Out of this, 25 patients were on HFNC and 12 patients on invasive mechanical ventilation. So were mostly used in HFNC patients in the first wave. Steroids was used in 100% of the patients. All our patients were getting steroids. Remdesivir was used in almost half of the patients, and survival was 43%. In spite of giving steroids to all the patients, we did not see a very good survival. It was only 43% in our patient, in our experience. Although the timing of administration varied, it was 3 days to 7 days of hospitalization. This was mainly because of the availability issues. And there were a certain number of patients who required TCZ twice. These were only 4 patients. And these, all 4 patients, they did not show improvement with the first dose. That's why a second dose was considered. Our present protocol, we give according to the national guidelines. We see whenever we see a patient with severe COVID who is requiring HFNC, NIV or IMV, we give high dose of steroids, wait for 24 hours, check for the inflammatory markers like CRP, IL-6, ferritin, and procal. If these are raised despite steroids above these values and patient is worsening with increasing oxygen requirements, then we consider tocilizumab only after ruling out contraindications. And after tocilizumab, we follow the patient with repeat IL-6 levels, which increase. We are very watchful for secondary infection. We try to keep patients who have been given tocilizumab in isolation, repeat procal and cultures if there is any fever. Just to highlight again what kind of a patient requires a tocilizumab, I'm just presenting two cases. We had this 45-year-old female, severe COVID, with SpO2 of 80% on room air. She was on HFNC. Standard care of treatment was started. However, day 2, she was worsening. Already she was getting steroids, but she was worsening. Her oxygen requirement was increasing. She required NIV. Lab values showed all the markers, they were raised, and procalcitonin was negative. This patient was given tocilizumab. And similarly, we had another patient who was again a case of severe COVID, SpO2 of 80% on room air. Day 1, she was on HFNC. Standard treatment was started. She improved from day 2 to day 8. She became afebrile, the oxygen requirement decreasing. However, on day 8, there was again fever, increased oxygen requirement, and now the lab markers, they are again raised. So is it an indication of tocilizumab? No, we have to rule out an infection. We have to get the procalcitonin. We got the procalcitonin done in this patient, which came out to be 15, and she was treated for secondary bacterial infections. So these cases just highlight which patient should be a candidate for tocilizumab. Lastly, this is a thing which we always say: if the patient is not improving on steroids, if TCZ is not available, what next? We can use high-dose steroids if TCZ is not available. And there is another class of drugs, JAK inhibitors, but it has not been studied much. So we don't have so much of data regarding this. I'm just having one slide, just want to tell what are JAK inhibitors. Again, these are Janus activated kinase inhibitors, which block several cytokine pathways, and they block various cytokines, interleukin 2, 6, and 12, and interferons. There is limited data, only one RCT available, which did not show any clinical significant improvement. And this RCT was performed before the widespread of steroids. So this should not be used. The drug which is widely used these days in private sector is baricitinib. Again, it has same contraindications and complications as tocilizumab. But again, the data does not support the use of this drug. In the conclusion, I would just like to answer a few of the frequently asked questions regarding tocilizumab. Should it be given to all patients who require oxygen? The answer is big no. There is only a selective group of patients it should be considered. Should it be given to all patients on HFNC, NIV, and IMV? No. Only in some patients who have increasing oxygen requirement and high inflammatory markers. Should it be given after 7 days of hospitalization? Less likely. It should be given usually during 24 to 48 hours of hospitalization, but it depends on the admission criteria of the hospital. Can it be given without IL-6 levels? Yes, we don't need to have IL-6 levels all the time. We can rely on CRP levels. If there's a marked inflammation with CRP levels more than 75 and the patient is not improving on steroids, we can think about it. And can a second dose be repeated? Yes, after 24 to 48 hours if there's no clinical improvement despite steroids and the first dose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richa Agarwal, for extensively covering the topic and providing details. I think we will have a lot of questions and a lot of issues as far as anti-IL-6 therapy is concerned. As you rightly showed, that this is a drug which has limited role. It's not that it has no role, it has limited role. The major trials were not able to show it. The more recent trials published recently have shown some benefit, and there is a study in Lancet also which showed some benefit as far as tocilizumab was concerned. So we have to really be able to position it properly and see that we cause no harm rather than good. And I think that is what you try to highlight in your presentation. We also really touched upon the issue of the JAK1 inhibitors, baricitinib, And this is also something which is creating a lot of interest because this is an oral drug which is available in our country. And there has been some speculation based on a recent press release based on the study that was done by Eli Lilly, that this may be useful also in severe cytokine storm, and whether we may consider that in place of tocilizumab is a debate which is still there, because in terms of availability, since a number of Indian companies are making this, whereas tocilizumab is a Roche product which is marketed by Cipla, there is this whole issue that could we use baricitinib instead of tocilizumab along with steroids in cytokine storm? We will come to that question later on as we go along to the discussion. But before I open it up and ask Rajiv to start, I'll just ask Dr. Anjan and Dr. Neeraj if they have anything to add before we start the panel discussion. So over to you, Dr. Anjan.
Thank you, sir. I think you said everything possible about TOSI. It's just that this is the right forum to tell the whole country that one need not run around the whole city or the whole state at breakneck speeds and trying to get it. Patients can survive without TCZ being available. And however, we all know, and we have seen it, that the costs go up. It is available in black market. And as far as we are concerned, the first patient which we had, and I'm sure Dr. Guria remembers him, we used it for the first time in the month of April, I think 6th of April. And that is the time when it was easily available, 28,000 rupees. And somebody came and delivered it, the pharmaceutical chap. He was more than happy to come, and he gave us his number that we could call him anytime and he would deliver it. But that was only for 7 days. And then I'm sure he changed his numbers and he never answered our calls. So this is the right forum to talk about it. And equally important, Dr. Guleria has stressed his JAK1 inhibitors. They are the buzzwords. And by now, all of us know it's all a lot about industry driven. The country where that industry is, Europe versus USA versus whatever it could be called. And maybe in the next 30 minutes, we could address that issue also. Maybe Neeraj wants to add anything, sir.
No, sir, most of things have been said, but again, one more important point, I'm sure as we discuss further, it will be key. All Zumab should not be interchanged. If somebody is not getting tocilizumab, he is going for bevacizumab or itolizumab. So all these Zumabs or monoclonal antibodies, as we call them, are not meant for all the patients of COVID-19. And before you jump and run around for any of these medications, one has to take into account whether the patient is actually going to benefit or not. So what type of clinical presentation the patient has, what is the duration of illness, what is the underlying problem, whether it has become now superadder infection, which is causing all the problem. All these things have to be kept into mind before saying that this is cytokine storm, which is causing problem and patient might benefit from all these therapies. So I think we can start discussion and we will see how things are.
Thank you. Just one point which I think Neeraj raised, that we need to really see what is the action of different monoclonal antibodies. For example, itolizumab is basically an anti-CD6 monoclonal antibody, and it causes much more immunosuppression than the tocilizumab, and therefore sometimes it can lead to a higher chance of opportunistic infection. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that itolizumab is otherwise available in our country. It is something which is made by an Indian company. There is some data on its utility, especially from studies from Cuba itself, and one trial done in India itself where AIIMS was also involved in a small number of patients, which has been published. But I think we have to be very careful when we look at interchanging TOSI with itolizumab because of the degree of immunosuppression it causes. And that is something that we need to keep in mind. So over to you, Rajiv, for the questions. And I can see some hands have already gone up, so we can have comments from the panelists, and then we can have the questions.
Dr. Marva, you wanted to say something?
Yes, sir. We've used tocilizumab during the first wave, and we've used it in approximately 60 patients. And we started as early as April. And the first patient who I remember was a resident who was admitted with us. And at that time, steroids was not the standard of care. And he did well with tocilizumab. And later on, we started using it when patients were progressing in spite of steroids. So if the oxygen requirement was increasing, they were on NRBM, they were going on non-invasive ventilation. And the cause of deterioration was not pulmonary embolism, it was a higher inflammation. So markers such as raised CRP with a negative procalcitonin were the indications where we used. And we found that the younger individuals, we had better response. Generally, the older patients, they did not improve, those who had comorbidities. So the right window, and these are all patients who were in the second week. So the right window and the right patient where inflammation is a cause of deterioration, we found very good results, especially in the younger patients and not in those who had significant comorbidities. And we found that the CRP was the best marker, which showed which patients are likely to respond. And also after giving tocilizumab, the CRP was the first marker to improve. We found that the LDH, ferritin, and IL-6 would not improve because it blocks the receptor. But even the LDH, ferritin, they persistently remained elevated. But the first marker of response was a drop in CRP along with the plateauing of the oxygen requirement. So these patients who were deteriorating from 8, 10, 12 liters, they were going up on NIV, about to get intubated, they just plateaued over there, and then weaning took its own time. So there is a definite window of opportunity where they can be used, especially in the early second wave, early cytokine storm, and not as late as when they are already on the mechanical ventilator. So that needs to be kept in mind. And also we were very particular to rule out contraindications, like if the patient has got active tuberculosis or fungal infection, and also gut issues, because gut perforation, which has not been mentioned, is also reported with tocilizumab. So any patient who's got gut issues, he's got Crohn's disease and all, we were very careful not to use in those patients. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think very, very important points, because this is something we need to keep in mind. I think Anjan can bear me out. Our experience with Tosi also has been better if it's used in a younger age group, and also those who did not intubate. Once you've intubated a patient, the chances of opportunistic infection becomes much higher, including VAP. And therefore, the outcome was much better when we gave it early when we had cytokine storm, rather than very late when the patient has actually gone on to very advanced disease with high mechanical ventilation with high FiO2s.
Yes, I think, sir, you've said it rightly, and we really, I also fully agree with Dr. Marwa, whatever his experience is. After having said that, we would all know that older people will have more mortality anyway, right? And they would have diabetes or CKD or CLD. We did have better results, yes. Once the patients were intubated, there were inherently other reasons for also dying, you know. Patients would have VAP by the 5th day. And in all these scenarios, we have to discount the fact that the nursing care is not the best of the nursing cares which we would have in a non-COVID ICU without PPEs. So that makes it very important that what is the window where you want to use it. And it's always better to use it in that window than to go beyond that window. The COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that the basics medications are 5. It's all about using them at the right time and at the right dose and taking care of the infections. There was a period, and Dr. Gloria would be aware of it, that we used to buy as a thumb rule, escalate antibodies, maybe even think of using prophylactic antifungals if a patient has diabetes or CKD or showed that, because there was kind of a bottleneck on how quick we could get our cultures done and start antibiotics. So these kind of things would vary as per logistical issues available. But yes, I fully agree to what Dr. Marwa says.
So I'll just add one final comment. We've also found that, we've found a better result with the lower dose rather than the higher dose. So going for 4 milligram per kg is sort of somehow better for our group of patients or Indians rather than going for the 8 milligram per kg. So we usually tend to go between 4 to 5 milligram per kg rather than 8 milligram per kg, because somehow that has been our observation. Anjan can add to that if you want to add anything.
I think, again, to be honest, and I'm sure Dr. Gloria is part of all our treatment protocols, we had times when we thought of giving 800 milligrams at one go. Right? Yes. Don't raise your eyebrows, Dr. Marwa. We did that, and because we were new, the disease was new, and let's be honest, the disease was new, the treatment was new, and we didn't know the results, and we just went by weight, 8 milligram per body weight. But now we've come down to 4 milligram. We don't go beyond 400 milligrams. And yes, in times of problems, though, all over the corporate world, they have used the subcutaneous 180 milligram pre-filled syringes also. We have been lucky enough to have the 400 milligram ones, but we used them twice. But then now most of the times we've got away using just once, and it will be very rare in the last 4 months now. Maybe the surge is back again and we don't know what we do in the next 4 to 8 weeks, but we've not used them twice at all for the last 4 months or so.
Another observation, if I may add, sir, because a lot of junior colleagues, they believe that it will be a magic bullet. You fire tocilizumab and patient will come off the non-invasive ventilator. So just wanted to dispel that myth, because once you give them tocilizumab, they just plateau where they are. So if they are on NIV with 60% oxygen, they remain on 60% for a while. The further deterioration is prevented. It is not that they would come immediately off the NIV. So they would spend another 5-7 days of NIV and then eventually improve. So similarly for mechanical ventilation, also if you are starting early, then the patient is not likely to come off the vent within the next 24-48 hours. So
I
that is the
think,
kind of response you're looking at.
I'll just add to it. I think this has to be told to the people in the smaller cities or the corporate world, the smaller corporate hospitals in grade B, C cities, because they think that they give a slip, you get tosi from the market, they run around, and then once it doesn't work, they go on breaking nursing homes. So it is not the wonder drug. As a matter of fact, we don't have a wonder drug for COVID-19. We don't have a single wonder drug. So it has to, and you rightly said that once you give tosi, you gain some more time. The patient after immediately, and then it happens, and then we take care of the patient and support him.
True.
Okay, so I think we'll move on to the question and answers. And again, thank you everybody for joining in. And I'll try and maintain a trend so it stays in line. We'll begin with the steroids, their dose, and when to add tosi. So a number of people have asked this question. How high are you willing to go in terms of steroids? What is high dose for you? And how long would you wait with that high dose before you thought that let's give tocilizumab here? So how high can you go on steroids? How long do you wait after you've given your high dose to give tosi?
I think it's a very important question, because this is something which a lot of people do, and they even ask, can I give a pulse steroid? So maybe we can ask Richa, and then maybe Anjan can add on to that.
Right, sir. So there are not much data available on the pulse steroid. Yes, there has been one randomized clinical trial from Iran where they used pulse steroid, that is 250 milligram for 3 days, and then compared it with a low dose, and they show that it could improve the clinical outcome. But here at AIIMS, we are using 125 milligram first for the first day, and then we decrease it to 60 milligram BD. We see him clinically. Most of our patients, they respond to such high dose of steroids. Sometimes we need to give another pulse, that is 125 milligram. We are not giving more than that.
Yeah, so this is methylprednisolone.
Methylprednisolone, so we are giving.
Anjan?
Yes, I think Richa has said it correctly. That's the practice which we have. We really don't do what we've seen it happening, and people have been giving 500 milligram of methylprednisolone twice a day and then shifting patients to us, or giving 500 milligram in their house by the IV route and then shifting to us. And I think that, we should all try to condemn this kind of practice, especially if given at home. The pulse therapy, what was there in that original article from Iran, was just about 250 milligrams a day. And normally 60 milligram thrice a day would come to 180 milligram. And maybe if somebody is sick enough, or he is being transferred, people tend to give 125 bolus, and that's about all. So one should not really go beyond that. And the saddest part is that this high dose of methylprednisolone is being given at home on day 3 of fever. And sadly enough, doctors are doing it to their own selves, their own parents, their own wives and children. And they're just the whole disease and the treatment goes haywire. They beat all guidelines, and this is what has to be put across. We've had patients who within 3 days have had about 2 grams of methylprednisolone and baricitinib also, and then some antibiotics, and then they've come back to us and we don't know what to do with them. So high dose steroid pulse, maybe if you want to give a single dose because of some certain reasons, or you're shifting patients, there's nothing on the way, but nothing more than that. I think 60 TDS, 180 milligram would be good enough in an adult patient, and you maintain within that dosage. Maybe Dr. Guleria could add to it. He's seen patients with 500 milligram TDS.
I know which patient you're talking about, but what I'm trying to say is that I don't think there is enough data to really support high dose steroids, and a lot of people have given pulse. I remember talking many months ago to a doctor in Punjab who said, I can't get tosi, so I've started giving 500 milligram prednisolone as bolus in place of tocilizumab. Now that is also not something which one can say is equivalent. So therefore, I would say that the data is not there. It really leads to patients' sugars going haywire, so many other things happening in terms of opportunistic infection. There is really no role of giving high dose methylprednisolone or steroids. Low dose to a moderate dose is all that we would give. I would actually err in most patients toward the lower dose rather than even the moderate dose.
And the follow-up question to that was, how long would you wait after you'd given your high dose or whatever you considered a high dose before you said it's not working and we need to add TOSI? So is there a time response, or is it just pure clinical response, or is there a minimum period after the high dose?
So Anjan, if you can answer that, and maybe if needed,
Right,
that's to add.
Right, sir. I think Richa covered it up, that if you have a patient who is on steroids and you're monitoring him and seeing him, his oxygen requirement is going up and it's about 24 to 48 hours, is not improving. Maybe his oxygen requirement has gone up tremendously. He is throwing fever all over, and that is the time when you think TOSI should be used, and that is a window period. Once having used that, one must realize that you would continue the use of your own steroids, whatever methylprednisolone or dexa, what you are using. So this is the time frame when you look at. If you are in a place where you could easily get your markers done, then it is good enough. A lot of places getting these markers done also is a bit of a problem. So that's why we had mentioned I'm sure Richa had mentioned that these IL-6 levels were not really necessary if you decide to use that. So 24 to 48 hours, decreasing clinical parameters, increasing oxygen requirements, blood pressures not being very comfortable, generally the cytokine storm coming in. This is the time when you think about it. Neeraj, do you want to add anything from your side?
Yes, sir. So what we have observed that the lab findings and even radiological findings are lagging behind the clinical deterioration. So if we see a lab finding which is showing deterioration today is actually reflecting 2 days back status. So that's what we have observed clearly. So it's a clinical deterioration that should actually determine whether this patient may be considered for any of this IL-6 therapy or any of the neotherapies we talk about. Just relying on the radiological worsening or the lab value is not advisable. If patient's oxygen requirement is increasing, the rate of breathing is increasing, PF ratio is dipping. So these should be the ideal markers in conjunction with if lab values are also supporting that. But if only lab values should not be taken into account.
Okay. Few questions on the dose, and I know Professor Guleria addressed this about using 4 mg per kg, the dose as what we are finding, but there are people who've asked specific questions. That trials have used 8 mg per kg, so why are we using 4? And second, the half-life is pretty long, so why are we using 2 doses?
Okay, Neeraj, do you want to answer that?
So again, like I said, we are using 4 milligram per kg body weight, but trial has used 8 milligram per kg body weight. So one of the reasons why initially it was thought to repeat if required. And apart from that, if we do too much immunosuppression in such patient, it's going to be, I will say, another Pandora box which we might open in form of opportunistic infection or superadded infection. So one of the reasons why 4 milligram was selected is like that only.
I'd just like to add to this that this is more of our own observation based on the fact that those who were got a lower dose of 4 to 5 actually fared better in terms of long-term outcomes and side effects as compared to those that we were giving 8. We started off with very high dose, as Anjan mentioned. We used to give 8 milligram and to all our patients in the beginning, having a lot of other issues, and then we started looking at can we get away with 4 to 5 milligram per kg, and that seemed to also work very well. So in that group of patients, we realized that this is based on our own observation. But I think in our own ethnic population, possibly giving a relatively low dose would be more useful and would really help. Anjan can add to that.
Yes, I think, sir. I think we came to this dose out of, I wouldn't call it hit and trial, but out of experience. Equally important was that the blood sugars were going haywire. We were having a tough time controlling blood sugars. We were a tough time controlling blood sugars along with insulin infusions and getting blood sugars done regularly. So we hit upon this idea that let's first use 400 and then try to use another 400. And now gradually over the last 14 months, we realized that 400 would be the number we are comfortable with. And that amounts to 1 vial. and now it is worth its weight in gold. So you need not use 1.5 vials, because the second half, unless you have a patient coming. So 400, we found it good enough. And sugar, one has to chase and take care of them.
So staying on the dose, another question is on using it subcutaneously. So can you use a subcutaneous Tosi formulation?
Okay, Anjan, you can answer that. That is something that we've discussed in the past also.
Yes, I think the subcutaneous dose, to be honest, at least I was not aware in the month of May or June last year, a subcutaneous dose was available. And once it went out of the market, we were told that a pre-filled syringe of a subcutaneous dose of 180 milligram was available. Generally, we realized that if a patient is in storm or generally patient is hypotensive, you don't try to give drugs, you prefer to give drugs which are IV and not via any other route. So after having said that, there have been instances in Jalandhar, Ludhiana, Patiala, where the IV formulation is not available, and people have asked us, what's the harm of giving it? They have given 3 of those 180 milligrams subcutaneously. So there is no data regarding that. They've used a lot of these formulations subcutaneously on an OPD basis in rheumatoid arthritis patients. That's why people who were dealing with these kind of disease were comfortable using it. We haven't done it, unless Dr. Guleria has had some information from anywhere.
No, like you rightly said, rheumatologists are more comfortable with it, and sometimes they would say that it can be done. Maybe if there's anyone in the panel who would like to give their experience as far as the subcutaneous part is concerned, because we've used it very occasionally.
Dr. Atul.
Okay, taking it from a rheumatologist's perspective, tocilizumab we've been using now for almost 6 years, and works beautifully. We generally don't have too many of the side effects that we talk about, except for a little bit of upper respiratory tract infections, a little bit of nasopharyngitis, occasional herpes here and there, but generally nothing very much, not much of tuberculosis, definitely not the level of the fungal infections, the level of fungal infections we see. So that was one. Second is the dose we use is of 400 milligrams, or to be more accurate, 480 milligrams. So that's in rheumatology practice, and we're using it once a month, so it is pretty okay. The CRP, as Vikas Marwa has said, CRP does, of course, come down very fast because it's IL-6 that is driving the CRP production by the liver, and it does come down, and that shouldn't come as much of a surprise. The itolizumab came up at a time where they tried to pit it against some of the other the other anti-cytokines, but we found it to be a very poor comparator, or a very poor drug as compared to the prevailing the TNFs, or the other drugs that were present, the secukinumab, the other drugs that were present for psoriatic arthritis. So we didn't really use much of itolizumab. So we're okay. I mean, as Dr. Guleria said, 400 milligrams, I think, is an excellent dose. Giving it one up again, there's really nothing wrong with giving it one up. As regards the comparator with subcutaneous tocilizumab, the trials with subcut in COVID really have not been done, so we're really not sure what the dynamics are like. So here in rheumatoid, you probably give a shot and you can wait for 4 weeks and then give a repeat dose like we do with tocilizumab in rheumatoid. But here you're giving it for a cytokine storm, and then again, I think as Dr. Trikha said, the loading dose or the IV dose possibly would be a much better idea. We give single shots, we don't repeat the dose of tocilizumab. And again, as Marwa said, you need to wait, I think, for a day or two for the disease to kind of settle down, plateau, and work on other things. And then maybe 6-7 days down the line, look for a secondary infection. Most importantly, since we're advising this drug and since we're talking about using it in peripheral hospitals or district hospitals, I think the bottom line here is your lab support has to be very good, because you've got to screen for tuberculosis, you've got to screen for bacterial infections, you've got to screen for fungal infections, you've got to look at your CRP, you've got to look at your procalcitonin. And if that is not available in the peripheral centers, I would suggest do not try this drug. You move on, you can play around with steroids. On a technicality, when we talk of dose of steroids, a dose of 30 milligrams is considered high dose steroids, and a dose of 250 and above is considered pulse dose of steroids. That is talking of it technically. I think there were 2-3 questions. I thought I'd answer that. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll continue with your comment briefly about itolizumab. So there have been a couple of questions that if TOSI is not available, can we use bevacizumab, infliximab, itolizumab? So any of the other agents. So is that okay?
So I think Richard touched upon that. Richard, would you like to just answer that? The other monoclonal antibody.
Yes, sir. So all the Zumabs are not the same drugs. The IL-6 inhibitors are that tocilizumab and sarilumab, and there are other inhibitors of IL-6 but not of the receptors. So these are different drugs. One. Secondly, itolizumab is anti-CD6 monoclonal antibody. It is not related to the IL-6. So these are different drugs, but these have not been studied. These are not in even the NIH guidelines, not in the UK guidelines also. No data is available. So we should not be running around these different kinds of fancy drugs.
So the bottom line message there is that itolizumab, bevacizumab, and infliximab are not equal to tocilizumab, and don't just substitute one for the other.
Yes.
The other questions again are on timing, and I know Neeraj touched upon this on how clinical deterioration seems to occur before biochemical or laboratory deterioration occurs. And the question here is that the CRP and IL-6 are mildly raised, but the patient shows deterioration at about 48 hours. Would be from room air to NIV and might need intubation. So would such a patient be a candidate for tocilizumab and intubation at the same time?
So this is a question where you need a lot of clinical sort of acumen, I would say. Neeraj, maybe you can answer that, because this has to be individualized in what do you do in such a patient who is deteriorating, but you're not sure, the inflammatory markers are not there. I think what has happened is, I mean, this is just a general statement. We have lost the patient and relied more on biomarkers. Unfortunately, that has led to a lot of sort of, I think, improper treatment, if I put that. You must put the patient in the center. Look at your patient and then look at your biomarkers, rather than look at the biomarkers first and then looking at the patient. Everything is dependent on what is these values, and then should I hike up steroids? Should I hike up? Should I give tocilizumab? The bottom line should be, how is your patient doing? Biomarkers was something we never looked at in critical care. I mean, I don't think that we in the ICU before this we would look at IL-6 and decide, and now should we do this or look at the CRP and decide whether we should start treatment or not. So it was always based on patient's oxygen requirement, how he was doing hemodynamically, the general sense that you got, how the rheological picture was looking like. So I think this is something very important. Neeraj could add on to that.
Yes, sir. That's what the bottom line should be, that each patient has to be looked as per his or her clinical status. So suppose if the patient's day of illness is somewhere around 21, 22 and his or her requirement is going on, increasing. So it could be just because the lungs have become fibrosed and whatever oxygenation strategy we are using may not be sufficient for that particular disease lung. So in that situation, even if you give tocilizumab or any of the monoclonal antibodies, that patient may not actually benefit from that. So you have to take into account the day of illness, how much steroid you have given, what could be other possibilities. Many a times the patient may simply have underlying pneumothorax or something of that complication, which if we are just looking on the lab parameters, then we might be missing that thing. So we have to rule out other causes of not able to maintain saturation for that patient. And depending on that, one can take a call whether that patient is going to benefit from tocilizumab or not. Just because the patient is not maintaining saturation because of whatever treatment we are giving is not an indication for starting tocilizumab.
Right, thank you, Neeraj. Yeah, Richa, you wanted to say something?
I just wanted to add that there is some mild elevation of CRP which occurs in the COVID-19 per se also. And not all the elevation is cytokine storm. So you have to keep in mind that the mild elevation does occur in COVID-19 mild disease also.
Right, and continuing on starting TOSI, there are a couple of questions. Do these patients need to be isolated? Should they be started on prophylactic antifungals or antibiotics? Richa, you want to start on that?
Yeah, Richa, you can take that.
Sir, in our institute, whenever we start the TOSI, we try to keep the patient in isolation. We don't have isolation rooms per se, but then we try to keep it in a side or corner of the ICU. One, because we have so many patients these patients are already on steroids and they have high sugar levels. The sugar levels are we are not able to manage them with plain insulin. We have to give regular insulins and on IV infusions. So both the things, TOSI and steroids, they increase the risk of infection. Regarding prophylactic antibiotics, yes, we are using it. We start on prophylactic antibiotics in those patients in which we start tocilizumab.
What about antifungals?
Antifungals, we do not start in all the patients, yes, but if the patient has any pre-criteria that he can have fungal infection, he has certain comorbidities like CKD and diabetes, which is uncontrolled, then we may add antifungals also.
So I think this again, you will have to individualize as far as treatment is concerned. But I do agree that very often in the ICU, in a critical care setting, if you have a person who's on steroids and you started tocilizumab, we would cover with good gram-positive and gram-negative antibiotics. And we would keep our hospital profile, the antimicrobial profile in mind in terms of what is the common bugs that we find there and what is the sensitivity, and based on that decide on the antibiotics to give. So it could vary from something like cefoperazone, sulbactam to piperacin tazobactam to a carbapenem. Along with that, times we would also give a gram-positive cover, something like Targocid. But if you have a person whom you are worried about fungal infection, and again, not very frequently done, but in a person who has very high sugars, not getting controlled, other factors which may predispose to this, one could consider covering with antifungal, although we don't do that commonly. That's not something that we would do very frequently. Anjan, you want to add anything on this?
Yes, sir. I think you pointed out very correctly that as per the standard practice, use of antifungals for these patients would not be mandatory. Use of empirical antifungals in any group of ICU patients remains essentially the same what it was before COVID areas. But in the COVID area, one needs to keep a low threshold of starting antifungals. If you also starting TOSI in a patient who's at a high risk, let's say he's a dialysis dependent CKD and he comes, then it is always worthwhile to have a low threshold. At times we have done that. And other group of patients where we feel a bit, we have a very low threshold is people who are shifted from one nursing home to another nursing home, from another hospital who come to us. They are having hospital acquired infection from that area. So this is the time when we really check up our markers. We have the luxury to get it. We do our markers, we do our procals, and then we see everything else. And then we could have, or we do start once in a while, empirically antifungals, keep taking into consideration other patient condition also regarding liver function and the renal function.
Right. Now, the next question again is on use of TOSI and non-availability of biomarkers. So we've already discussed that biomarkers should probably not be the driving force, but if Procal also is not available, so how would you rule out infections before you, sepsis before you started TOSI, supposing it's a smaller center and Procal levels are not available? Are they essential before you give TOSI?
So Neeraj, what is your opinion on this?
So again, one of the panelists has said that if in doubt, don't give tocilizumab. It's not a life-saving. In fact, it can do more harm. So if you are clinically having suspicion of superadded infection, especially in peripheral center where one cannot be sure based on other lab findings or whatever if they don't have, because if you can't monitor these patients, if you give TOSI and you actually do more harm to the patient. So I don't think this should be tried unless there is adequate setting to handle any complication arising out of this.
I agree with that. Better to avoid rather than really going ahead for it. Also look at your clinico-radiological profile and look at the things like TLC. Is the X-ray showing a patch which was not there, and is it looking like a lobar consolidation with a near bronchogram? Things like that, which will suggest that this is more likely to be a secondary bacterial infection rather than a cytokine storm. So look at the patient holistically, but if you are not sure, better to avoid rather than giving it, because it may cause more harm than good.
Right, so this is an interesting one now. Can you give the subcutaneous variant intravenously? If you don't have the intravenous one available, can you give the subcutaneous one intravenously?
I don't think so. Dr. Atul can sort of answer that, or Anjan can.
No.
I think it's not on. It is something like giving an IV IM preparation. The most common was diclofenac, which went into a lot of problems, and IM preparation being given IV and people ending up into problems. So it's a big no. We should not be using it. And if somebody does it, he is doing something which is medico-legally wrong.
Yes, I think the bottom line answer is no, you can't use a substitute preparation IV. A couple of questions on which steroid and which variant. So dexamethasone, methylprednisolone, prednisolone. So is there any specific reason to choose one over the other?
I think this is more on personal choice, but Neeraj can probably touch on that, and if Richa wants to add on to that.
Yes, sir. Right from the start of pandemic, when we had initial patients, we have been using methylprednisolone. So you can say we are more accustomed to using methylpred. But equivalent dose of prednisolone or dexamethasone can be used. The half-life of the other drugs may vary, the potency may vary, but overall effect we expect it to be similar. So depending on availability, one can take whatever steroid is available can be given where indicated. Again, I will say where indicated, not in everyone.
Right. Yes, Dr. Marva.
If I may ask, I may add, because this dexamethasone came into the picture because of the recovery trial. So I discussed this with my colleagues over there in UK, and they mentioned that they used dexamethasone because during the pandemic, it was freely available in the wards. So it was not only a scientific reason, it was the availability as well as the cost. As we see in the NHS, the cost of methylprednisolone is much more. So that is why they started off with dexamethasone. Here in India, as a pulmonologist, our experience with methylprednisolone is much more, be it acute exacerbation of asthma, COPD, or diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, where we are routinely using pulse methylprednisolone. So the only place where I remember where I've used dexamethasone is TB meningitis. So from the pulmonology perspective, methylprednisolone has been having much wider use in India. And DEXA came into the picture because of other reasons other than scientific.
Again, continuing on these questions about inconsistency between biomarkers and clinical. I mean, we made it multiple times, but I'm taking it up just once again, that is it justifiable to give tocilizumab if your biomarkers don't show an elevation, neither of IL-6 nor of CRP, but clinically you feel the patient has deteriorated? So Neeraj, again, it's coming back to that same issue of using biomarkers to either trigger the dose or to justify the dose. So is it justifiable to give it in the absence of abnormal biomarkers?
So again, if clinically it's just progression of cytokine storm, your steroid has not worked over last 24 to 48 hours of relatively high dose. Means if you are giving around 2 milligram per kg body weight at least, and it's not working and the patient is dipping. Sometimes just increase of oxygen requirement from 10 liters to 15 liters does not mean patient has dipped too much. But yeah, shifting from say the NRBM to high flow nasal cannula to ventilator, then that's a shift which we have to take into account. So depending on all these, of course, we have to take into account patient's clinical status, and one can take a call. But again, it has to be individualized. It should not be a standard process. I mean, it should not be a protocol that every patient who is deteriorating should be given tocilizumab just because of that.
Sir, may I add something to that? Actually, we are not using tocilizumab at our center, and we are seeing that when we give steroid, it usually takes 1 to 2 days minimum. So we should not, according to national guideline, we have to wait for 24 hours. I think that is not wise, because steroids usually take time to work, and if you jump to tocilizumab soon, most of the patient will require tocilizumab. So we are not giving tocilizumab at our center for last 6 months, and most of our patients, I will say, are improving in absence of tocilizumab. So I think we should wait more. I'm not a very big fan of tocilizumab, but giving steroid, I think that is the best savior in this kind of patients.
If I may add here, sir, the increase in oxygen requirement, there are multiple causes to that. Because if suddenly there is increase in oxygen requirement, the patient might have had a pulmonary embolism. So if there might be no inflammatory component to that. So tocilizumab is meant as an anti-inflammatory drug. So if you get an inflammatory marker, that is helpful, because the patient's increased oxygen requirement may be because of, say, a pneumothorax or a pulmonary embolism. There are multitude of causes. As an anecdote, one of my friends, he asked me whether a patient who's deteriorating, should we give him tocilizumab? I asked, what is his pulse rate? He said it's 110, and he's developing hypotension. So I said, you better do a CTPA first, because it's more likely to be pulmonary embolism. And it turned out to be, lo and behold, it turned out to be pulmonary embolism. So every increase in oxygen requirement is not cytokine storm. There are multiple other causes which you need to look at, especially if these patients are on non-invasive ventilation, high flow. They do develop pneumothorax and they have other prothrombotic complications as well. So if you have a rising CRP with a negative procalcitonin, if you have the facilities to do that, that is probably cytokine storm. If you have a rising CRP with a high procalcitonin, that is sepsis. So probably that is a patient where you should not use. So biomarkers are helpful, and if you have them, they actually help in the decision making.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon, sir. Sir, I wanted to know, in a second this wave, when we are getting more cases of young patients and rapidly they are going towards the looking like cytokine storm, like we see their X-rays, it shows more than 50% involvement in the first week only. Should we have a low threshold of giving tocilizumab in these cases? Like in the first week only after 1 or 2 doses of steroids.
I think the question is, within 1 week, if you have a young person who's deteriorating, should you have a low threshold of giving TOSI early rather than late? What is your opinion, Neeraj? Because like has already been said, there can be multiple factors which can be linked to the deterioration. And that's why, like we said in the past, that a thorough evaluation is required, and sometimes you must also use your ultrasound to see whether you've missed out on something, because sometimes patient may be too sick for a CTPA, but ultrasound may also give you good information at the bedside in terms of possible pulmonary embolism or other things. Neeraj, what are your comments on?
I would like to touch few things on this. Over last 3 months, it has been said that youngsters are getting sick in the first week of illness itself, and that is something which I think needs to be addressed. Most of the time, what is happening that these patients have sick elderly in their houses and they are ignoring their symptoms initially, and by the time they get sick, they are getting themselves tested and they turns out to be positive, and we assume that this is their first week of illness. But in most of these cases, what we have observed and what on taking history, we have realized that they are usually 10th, 11th day of illness, not the first week which we are making out. So when you see a sick patient who is apparently in first week, keep your suspicion high. It's not viral pneumonia. It's mostly they are landing up in cytokine storm. And that's usually not the first week. So thinking that this virus is causing severe disease in first week of illness is, I think, is something which we are not interpreting properly. The viruses almost have similar presentation. Only thing is we are diagnosing late, especially in young population who are not taking care of their health. So again, depending on the clinical situation, if you are suspecting a cytokine storm, then one can, of course, we will have to start steroid initially, decide on the oxygenation strategy. And only after taking into account, I'm sure this, once we establish that this is cytokine storm, one can think of TOSI if required in appropriate setting. So just because patient is sick in first week, that doesn't mean he's actually in first week of illness.
Can I add something here?
Yes, sir.
See, I think it was rightly said by Dr. Guleria earlier on, we seem to have lost contact with the patient. You know, it's all about a CT scan, the score, start a drug, markers. How many times has somebody really seen the patient, seen whether the peripheries are cold, seen whether the patient is in frank sepsis, or maybe he has had a cardiac event. You know, even pulmonary embolism could be picked up quite a large number of times if it is massive by other things. So we need to go back to our basics, I think, than to go back to, like, let's say Procal. We all know that Procal has been has to be ideally used to de-escalate and not to escalate things. We all know that, but then we are putting a lot of stress on IL-6 and Procal. 1 year ago, I still remember in the month of April, we couldn't find a lab who could do an IL-6 in even our hospital. There was a project which was going on in the anatomy department who helped us out with IL-6. Now, IL-6 in the corporate world or in the private labs is done more frequently than a hemogram. So we as a group have to say no to it and then go back on a clinical sense.
I think that is something which is very important. And as as the Center of Excellence start training people in smaller towns and in rural India, it becomes more important, because in those areas, you won't have the luxury that you have in a tertiary care hospital. You will have to rely on clinical sense. You can't tell a person in a primary health center ki pehle IL-6 karo, then I'll take a call ki inko ab kya karna hai. You will have to go by the clinical parameters. So I think we must understand that if we are going to really develop protocols and look at how are you going to train people to manage COVID entire 3 cities in rural India in a primary health center, keep the background in mind. You can't insist that I can only manage this patient unless I see a CT scan. You will have to do with the poor quality chest X-ray. You will have to do with the clinical parameters. And that is why your decision will depend on that. Unfortunately, we have become more and more biomarker and scan oriented. Maybe it's because of the fear of COVID that we don't want to really look at the patient. We want to look at the values. But I think it's more important for us to keep that in mind. And as Neeraj mentioned, very often it's patients will not come out with their symptoms unless you really probe and say, how long have you been having cough or fever or upper respiratory catarrh? And sometimes it may be that they are actually coming late because of multiple reasons. And it's true for the younger age group because they feel that they will get a mild illness and they will get away with it.
Nigrams wanted to say something here.
Sir, our situation is entirely different. We never use the tocilizumab in our setup. It is not available also, and we never tried also, because looking at the and what we see that like if you will follow the basic things, that is steroid, anticoagulant, that is sufficient to treat most of the case.
Very good. I totally agree with you. This is the message that we have to percolate down at a primary health level.
So we never tried also, sir, to procure the tocilizumab because it's not available. So why to put your head on those things? Rather you use the whatever the things it is available at present.
We have a couple of panelists who raised their hands. Yeah, Richa, carry on.
That is exactly the same. If you should remember, I showed the data. We got 1,000 odd ICU admission, and we used tocilizumab in only 39 patients. So we also use in very selective group of patients, not in all. And it is after a lot of thought process goes in, after lots of discussion. It is not one person's deciding about tocilizumab.
I'll just add here, Rajiv, if you want, if you allow me, Rajiv.
Yes, sir, of course.
Each one of us who's dealing with these patients, no matter which hospital it is, we realize that a large number of drugs are being used and it is tough time to not to use them because of social pressure. First, it was plasma, and plasma came in a big way and it is still in a big way. You could get phone calls from four different people. Maybe somebody who's totally unrelated to medicine would phone you up and put pressure to use plasma. The same is true with now Tosi, because it is it is difficult to get. Somebody has got it, now you must use it. So maybe in a public hospital, we can get away being very firm. But if you are in a private setup, a smaller setup or a corporate hospital, social pressures also, try to, take care of the treatment, what you are planning. And I'm sure each one of us has faced these kind of pressures.
Right, thank you, sir. So we have a couple of people who've raised their hands on the panel. Maybe we'll just allow them to speak. So Dr. Punil Panjwani, I'm going to unmute you if you'd like to speak. Dr. Sunil Panjwani.
Sir.
Yes, please carry on.
Hello. Sir, we are using tocilizumab and steroids, but whenever we are going for tocilizumab, we decide in a committee and then we decide the dose. And we go for the IL-6 level as well as the procalcitonin level. But we are not going for TC level. Even if TC level is high and procalcitonin is low, we are giving the tocilizumab. Is it right, sir?
So, Anjan or Richa, you want to answer that?
What level he said? TC level, I couldn't get it.
Even I couldn't get it. TC level.
Can you clarify?
Sir, total count, total WBC count, even if it is high, we are giving the tocilizumab.
No, I think we touched upon it earlier also, that you must first try to confirm whether patient is going into a cytokine storm. And one thing which you're doing very excellently is that you are trying to discuss pros and cons of it in a committee, which we also do at our center. No single person decides to use Tosi. We normally try to discuss and then decide to use it. If you have a high TLC, the patient is showing signs of infection, you don't have the markers to do, you can take care of, you can upgrade your antibiotics, have a look, and then go ahead. Many times there could be possibility that patient is going into a cytokine storm, is a diabetic, is a CKD patient, could also have some kind of infection somewhere. So that is a time when you look at TLC and not try to give enough weightage to it and start TCZ. However, if TLC is high, a patient is showing sign of sepsis, first you'll have to take care of the antibiotics and then only go in for TCA.
Okay, sir.
Richard,
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Just wanted to add something.
Yeah, yes, sir. So TLC is slightly difficult to interpret in such patients because they are usually on steroid, and steroid usually will cause neutropenia and lymphopenia. So again, just relying on TLC as a marker for infection may be difficult in such patients. So we have to look for other evidence of infection as well.
Right. So the next.
Thank you, sir.
The next person is Dr. Mungeli, who wants to speak. So Dr. Mungeli, if you'd like to speak, raise your question. Dr. Mungeli, your hand was raised. You can unmute yourself. All right. So we'll move on to the next person, Dr. Pawan Kapahi. Dr. Pawan Kapahi, you raised your hand.
Hello.
Yes, please carry on.
Sir, I want to ask a personal question. My father-in-law was admitted in ICU COVID ward, and now he is out of ICU COVID and in non-COVID ward. But he was on BiPAP. Now he's maintaining 92 SpO2 saturation with 12 liters of oxygen, but bilateral fibrosis of lungs. Sir, now what are the chances of recovery and prognosis of disease? Please tell me.
Dr. Pawan, we are avoiding personal discussions on personal cases. I don't know if some of the panelists want to do that, but we were trying to avoid discussion on individual cases and personal cases on the forum.
I'll just add that, it's difficult to answer just looking at what you're saying. One will have to look at your CT scan and see the need. But from personal experience, many patients who even have CT with 6 to 12 weeks, they have improved over a period of time, their oxygen requirement has come down, and with aggressive pulmonary rehabilitation, they have really improved. I had one patient who was admitted for almost, I think it was 3 months in an ICU on HFNC because of his bad lungs. And then we moved him to the private ward. We started pulmonary rehabilitation. And because he went into ICU psychosis, we started giving HFNC in the private ward rather than in the ICU. And gradually he went home on just 2 liters of oxygen and is now doing aggressive rehabilitation. He used to come from Bihar. He is now taken a small room in close to AIIMS so that he can come for regular follow-up. So patients do improve over a period of time, but it's a tough call because there is a lot of debate on what to do, antifibrotics and not. So I think this is not the forum that we can discuss this in detail.
Dr. Khandekar, you've raised your hand if you'd like to ask your question. Dr. Achyut Khandekar.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. I wanted to ask.
Can you please ask your question again? You got muted. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah,
I unmuted, sir. Hello.
Yeah.
Sir, it's the other way around. If the patient is clinically stable, say he is requiring 2 or 3 liters of oxygen, but his CRP somehow is above 100, should we still think of using tocilizumab or bevacizumab, whichever is available?
So Neeraj, what is your take on this? Patient is stable. He's got biomarkers done, which have gone through the roof. I mean, we've seen patients with IL-6 is also very, very high.
Again, sir, we will not ask to use any of these biomarkers if patient is clinically stable. And like I said, it could be just indicator of the previous insult which might have happened and now he has recovered from that. So you can just observe the patient and take call accordingly. If he's stable, it's not required at all. And of course, as mentioned earlier, all Zumabs are not same and they should not be interchanged.
So
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
A question on early use of low dose tocilizumab. So is there any role of giving it even before a full-blown cytokine storm sets in?
So like prophylactic dose,
Prophylactic.
Prophylactic low molecular weight heparin. Can you give prophylactic low dose tocilizumab? Richa, what is your take on that?
As I said, not all the patients will go into hyperinflammatory phase. It is only some patients who would go into this hyperinflammatory phase. So now 85% of the patients, they remain in the mild disease. They do not require anything. Only moderate to severe patients we are talking about here. And There's no role of prophylactic this thing. We cannot predict which patient will go into storm. There's no predictor markers here. So there is no role of these prophylactic TC6.
I think it's important to understand that there is really no role, and giving low dose is not going to work. There is a lot of such issues which come up. I mean, I remember many months ago having this big discussion with one, it was one of the ICUs, where the doctor argued that we should give all patients who are asymptomatic or even have mild illness remdesivir on day one, because it will decrease viral replication and it will not cause patients to have critical illness or come to the hospital. The data is not there, but he continued to insist on that and said this seems logical. So I have tried to argue with a lot of people that as was we said, giving treatment at the right time is very important for COVID-19. The right dose, the right drug at the right time. And majority of people, 85%, and I think this is a message we need to really put down to rural India also, will get all right with just paracetamol and symptomatic treatment. Forget all your other drugs, ivermectin, favipiravir, all of them. They are not really required. This will, in majority, this will resolve on its own. It's only those 15% that have this severe illness that we need to pick up and really treat aggressively. But the 85% are the ones who get all their scans done, get their biomarkers done, get their steroids, and create a lot of problem. If you were to do nothing in them and just give supportive treatment, I'm pretty sure they will become all right. And this is what has been done in the Western world. They don't have favipiravir available there. They don't have ivermectin available there. Their patients with just paracetamol and management and treatment for cough and cold have done, as well as patients in other parts of the world. So I think it's important to keep that in mind.
We've reached the end of our 90 minutes, sir. If you'd like to summarize and close.
So before I summarize, any comments from anyone in the group, including the panelists, that they want to really say something, both in terms of the treatment strategy for severe COVID-19, especially anti-IL-6?
Sir, I would just like to add here what you said. There is nothing no role of prophylactic low dose or anything of that kind. We are very lucky that TOSI is not available in the form of a tablet. Our rheumatology colleagues never told a drug company to make a tablet of TOSI earlier on, maybe 5 years ago. Or maybe by this time, everybody, half of Delhi would be taking TOSI tablets. They are already on, instead of Claxin, they are on oral anticoagulant. You know, anybody who has fever of 2 days is on dexamethasone, oral anticoagulants, and everything possible. So let's try to treat a severe disease the right way. Like sir has already said, only 15% people we have to pick up. We have not got to pick up the rest.
Okay, thank you. Richa, you want to say anything as a concluding remark?
No, sir.
Okay, anyone in the panel would like to add anything? So, okay, what I'd like to say is what Anjan really said, that we really need to look at how we are being able to treat our patients. And like he said, we need to really avoid the misuse of a large number of drugs, which is happening and causing problems. I mean, he mentioned some. I have many patients who doctors have started on Ecosprin. I don't know what is the role of Ecosprin, but many patients are on Ecosprin. And I worry about baricitinib because that's an oral tablet. It's something that can be available, and a lot of now generics are going to come out in the market because it has been approved for generic preparation. I think Natco is making it and other companies are going to start making it. My concern is that it may go down the same sort of path of being used a lot to prevent so-called steroid use or cytokine storm. So one of the disadvantages that we've had with oral drugs has always been this. I mean, one of the examples that we have is also with voriconazole. The misuse of voriconazole has been a lot because of the fact that it's a very good drug, but it is available as an oral preparation. The same is with linezolid, which is also very good good drug for MRSA, but because it is orally available, it is something which is used sometimes more often than when it should. So unfortunately, sometimes you have a disadvantage of oral drugs as compared to the parenteral ones. I just hope that we are able to educate people in terms of proper treatment and the fact that medicine is do no harm. I think that is something that we must keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll close this session today. We're meeting again at 3 p.m. tomorrow, and tomorrow we are discussing radiology, CT scans, X-rays, and radiology basically in the management of COVID. We look forward to seeing all of you again at 3 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.